Hello, I'm Fritz Mayer, Dean of the Joseph Corbell School of Global and Public Affairs at the University of Denver, and welcome to the Denver Dialogues. The Denver Dialogues is a series of conversations that the Corbell School and the Scribner Institute of Public Policy here at the Corbell School are proud to host in partnership with the American Enterprise Institute, AEI, the Hoover Institution, uh, New America, and the Aspen Institute. The idea is to have a series of conversations dedicated to engaging in and modeling civil discourse about major issues facing our nation and our world. And it's a central component of the University of Denver's broader suite of civil discourse programs and activities. Today's conversation is about one of the most hotly contested issues of the second Trump administration, tariffs. President Trump's unprecedented imposition of tariffs marked quite a departure from the trade policies that characterized America really since the end of the Second World War. It's just created uncertainty for consumers, for our trading partners, for the global economy. And President Trump's personalized approach to tariffs also posed questions on the limits of presidential power, an issue now before the U.S. Supreme Court. Today's discussion will explore the evolving impact of the Trump tariff policies, on global trade and the economy, on international relations, and on the balance of power between Congress and the presidency. So let me introduce my colleague and co-host of the Denver Dialogues, Professor Nazanin Barma, who's a professor here at the Corbell School and importantly, the director of our Scribner Institute. Naz.
Thank you, Fritz. We are so fortunate to have with us today three experts representing our Denver Dialogues partners and our shared broader network to help us understand where things stand with the Trump administration's tariff policy, an ever-changing landscape, and its emerging economic, political, and geopolitical implications. I'm going to read short bios for each one of our panelists, and you will find more details at the link in the chat. Wendy Edelberg is a senior fellow in economic studies at the Brookings Institution and a principal at West Exec Advisors. She served as director of the Hamilton Project at Brookings from 2020 to 2025. She joined Brookings after more than 15 years in the public sector, where she held a number of senior economic policy roles. Most recently, she was chief economist at the Congressional Budget Office. Mark Schmidt is the director of the Political Reform Program at New America, which seeks to develop new approaches to understanding and reforming the market for political power and the crisis of democratic governance. His previous roles include being the executive editor of the American Prospect, senior fellow and advisor to the president at the Roosevelt Institute, and director of the Governance and Public Policy Program at the Open Society Foundations. Nina Chennai is a non-resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, AEI, and a global trade attorney. Her previous roles include serving as a trade counsel for the House Committee on Ways and Means and as a trade policy counsel for the Senate Republican Policy Committee. She has worked as the senior advisor to the Assistant Secretary for Export Administration at the U.S. Department of Commerce and as a professional trainee in the Rules Division of the World Trade Organization. Thank you all so much for joining us. We could not be in better hands to help make sense of where we stand today on the tariff issue. Registered to join us for this conversation, which is our 10th installment of Denver Dialogues, are just shy of, right now, about just shy of 100 viewers from across the University of Denver, Denver Metro, and our broader community. We've already received a number of terrific questions, which we've worked into the program, which you're about to watch. And I'll remind everyone that we remain open for questions, which you can submit anytime. First, Fritz and I have four broad areas of questions on which we'll spend about 10 minutes each, and we will leave time to get into your questions as well. Back to you, Fritz.
Well, let me start with just some level setting here. As I said already, I mean, this is really quite uncharted territory, I think. I mean, we look back to the 1930s, perhaps the Smoot-Hawley Act, but that was passed by Congress as well. This is quite different, or at least it would so appear. Let me turn to you, Nina, first. All right, just how big a departure is this? How unprecedented is what we're seeing here in trade policy?
Thank you so much for the question, Fritz, and it's really great to be with you all this afternoon for this really important and timely subject. Well, I think you've asked sort of the existential question here, in terms of where this trade policy espoused by the Trump administration fits into the big picture. Well, let me say a few things here. There certainly is a new paradigm in U.S. trade policy. It departs significantly from the prior consensus that had governed trade, global trade, for the last 8 decades, really the post-World War II trading system, Fritz, that you just mentioned. And there's been this shift from a multilateral trade, rules-based approach to a unilateral approach in quite a stark fashion. And there's just been also an increasing use of a multitude of trade tools to achieve economic, foreign policy, and national security goals and objectives. Now, one thing I would say, though, is that this did not start this year. For President Trump, this is an area that he's actually been quite consistent on in terms of his principles and views since the 1980s. He was running ads against President Reagan on Japan and tariffs in the 1980s. For the rest of us, I'd say it's been about a 25-year trajectory that has seen us arrive at this point. There have been accelerants. We think back to 9/11, China joining the WTO, the Iraq War, the financial crisis, Russia's invasion of Crimea in 2014, migration in Europe, Trump 1.0, the COVID era, Biden, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, now the Trump administration. It's like this acceleration of issues with respect to rearrangement of the geopolitical order, technological change that's causing tectonic changes in social and political alignments. And the Trump 1.0, I think, really saw in earnest the use of these unilateral trade tools out of those, sort of the list of big events that I mentioned, which are by no means complete. And in Trump 1.0, there was generally sort of this steady, knowledgeable hands. USTR Robert Lighthizer, who had been in the Reagan administration, he had. I actually used to work for Bob as a baby lawyer. But he had for years raised concerns about the World Trade Organization and whether it was working for the United States. And, he took the step of placing tariffs on, $250 billion of imports from China in the first administration. At the time, we thought it was a sea change to use what's known as Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974 to impose these tariffs to respond to unfair trade practices from China. But it's a testament to the stickiness of this issue and that trajectory that President Biden did not remove those 301 duties. In fact, some of the duties were even increased. And in addition to this use of tariffs, we think sanctions, export controls, investment restrictions. So this has been a trend, and we are where we are now. A few quick words on the current situation, the Trump 2.0, and where we are here. It's generally, in my view, driven by this underlying notion that the U.S. has not received the benefit of its bargains, has not received a fair shake by trading partners. And if we look back to January 20th, there was the executive memorandum on an America First trade policy, the day that everyone thought the president would impose tariffs but didn't. But this directed reports from several agencies, and it focused on the causes of U.S. trade deficits, unfair foreign trade practices, and appropriate measures to remedy them, recommendations for new bilateral and sectoral trade agreements, trade and national security measures to address illegal migration and fentanyl. It seems like we've done some of these things, right? It was almost like oppression. It was a roadmap to what we've seen. In terms of style, it's been unilateral, and I know we're going to talk about this further, but acts without Congress. as well as the use of the IEPA national, so the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, national security statute to impose tariffs. Limited congressional action, so executive action, not congressional action. Transactional, so wanting to make deals, and every deal is zero sum. Experimental, use of unconventional legal theories, and the like. Substance, fairness and reciprocity. Tariffs as the standby solution, and global reordering, inclinations to attack allies and flatter adversaries. So it's been that, as I mentioned, the trajectory, but we are here where we are.
Well, thank you. You covered a lot of territory there, and you broached the question of what is the animating motivation behind this. I would say, just full disclosure, I was involved, as Mark knows, well, with the efforts to create the NAFTA many years ago, and so I'm someone who was part of that effort to create a rules-based international order, which, by and large, notwithstanding the pressures you identified, which are true, held more or less, at least the NAFTA and later the USMCA and other trade agreements. So I do think there's an acceleration, you called it that, I think, if not a complete break. But I would love to turn to you, Wendy, to help us think about what some of the themes that Nina laid out there, but help us think about the economic logic of this. So, the claim is that we've been mistreated, that this is a rebalancing, that this is sensible economic policy. And is that, in your view, the animating or an animating force here? And if so, is that correct? Is that a good reason to be doing what we're doing?
So much there. All right. So first, I'm gonna also take the prerogative to say thank you so much for having me. And very selfishly, I'm super excited to hear what both Nina and Mark have to say. I think I'm gonna learn a lot from them. So I just hope I can return even a small part of that favor. If we're going to call this an accelerant, like that we're in the same world that we had before, just in an accelerated way, I think people should have in mind something that looks like a hockey stick. Like we're easily an order of magnitude larger in this scheme of history, of recent history, in post World War II history, in terms of not just the magnitude of tariffs that we're dealing with, but also the lurching uncertainty that's born out of the fact that the president is doing this basically unilaterally, and so can change tariffs day to day and even over the course of the day. I don't want to overstate that things have settled down a bunch since the first part of the year, but the lurching aspect of this has been stunning, and just the height of the tariffs has been just quite remarkable. In terms of what the economic justification might be, I mean, tariffs are certainly one of the things that have always been in the toolkit to some degree, to whether it's to protect a nascent industry, and it's just one of the tools that you have on hand. That's essentially industrial policy. There can be lots of reasons why you might want to protect a particular industry. There can be economic reasons why you want a particular industry to grow. There can be national security reasons. And, of course, there can be political reasons as well. But all of those suggest very targeted tariffs. In order to come up with a rationale for the very broad-based high level of tariffs that we have, the fact that we have high levels of tariffs that are on all imports from a particular country. There you have to say we've clearly gone beyond economics, and we've now gone into the realm of using tariffs for foreign policy, using tariffs to benefit your friends and hurt your enemies. I think on some days, I think President Trump cares about the revenue that he's also getting from the tariffs, and maybe Congress also cares about the revenue, though I think that that's, pretty low down on the list. The economic rationale that is that is made that we need high tariffs on particular countries because we care about bilateral trade deficits. It is the scaffolding that I would have to put around that argument to make it make any economic sense is just breathtaking. Um, it, it is very hard to understand a universe in which bilateral trade deficits matter. Um, Now, in the world of aggregate trade deficits, do we really care that, we seem to be able to print money and send that money overseas in return for stuff? And basically, the world is willing to, just steadily lend us money so that we can, use to buy their stuff with? Maybe. But then, the way to solve that problem, is not through tariffs. The way to solve that problem is through, you know, changing incentives to save and lowering our deficit. I mean, if we thought that that was an issue. So it's hard to, I can't create an economic rationale for the
Yeah,
current
yeah,
for the current
yeah.
tariff scheme. The other rationale is that we just need to, uh, you know, we like manufacturing and we want to increase employment in manufacturing. There's no evidence that the tariffs in Trump 1.0 increased employment in manufacturing. And manufacturing employment has actually fallen since Trump became president. I don't want to put too much weight on that. There have been lots of things that have influenced the labor market since January 2025, but this is not a good way to increase employment in manufacturing. I mean, it's a good way to get profits to the, industry in the US that makes aluminum and steel. But that industry does not actually employ a lot of people. So wait, hold on one second. Hold on. Give me a minute. Just give me a minute. You can see I'm working late. I'm working late at
Relax.
Brookings. Um, so, but in terms of where we see the economic effects of this trade policy helping domestic industries, so we can look at price data of what's happened to imported goods. Probably it won't surprise people that imported goods are about 7% above where you would expect them to be if they had continued along their trend line. But domestic goods are also uh, up in terms of their prices relative to their trend lines. And that is, one of the basic economic effects of a tariff is that not only is it going to increase the price of the imported good, it's going to increase the price that domestic suppliers of that good can now charge because
Yeah,
they're now being protected.
yeah,
So
yeah.
we see the economic effects right in the data.
Well, thank you for that. Let me, if we, so it's a picture of the economy. It's not clear what the economic logic is, although there's some plausible logics there. Mark, you focus on the politics of this. As you listen to this, what would you ascribe the what we see to? What motivations you see for the pattern of tariff policies that we've seen in the Trump administration?
Yeah, thank you, Fritz. And it's a pleasure to be here and as always to reconnect. And we did years ago on the Hill. You were the NAFTA master. I was learning a lot by observation. I mean, I guess one thing that struck me from the previous conversations is that there is some continuity, as Nina pointed out, on the economic logic, and then it goes to another level that, as Wendy points out, is really hard to justify. But there's a really sharp shift on the politics, and I think, and um, I'm I think it's really hard to like you have to. What's hard to appreciate is that it's not like they went to executive power because Congress wouldn't act. There's a lot of stories in the Biden administration of, they wanted Congress to act on student loan forgiveness. They wanted Congress to act on migration, on immigration policies, and then they reluctantly grabbed on the reins of executive power, and that's a pretty common trend. This is, from day one, give the president wants the tools by which he can do everything, by which he can do whatever he wants unilaterally without the slightest attempt at first
Yeah.
working through Congress. And those are, there are several different tools, and the IEEPA is only one, which is the one that's up for at the Supreme Court right now, is only one. There are other ways you can do it.
This is the
But I'm really struck by,
International Economic Power, the Emergency
yeah,
Economic Powers
international.
Act. Yeah.
All I know is the acronym. I have to
Yeah.
say that's where I hit my limits. No, I mean, I think what's really striking is that it's become a kind of strutting of power, an ability to. It's not like they're changing day to day by accident. They're changing day by day because there's an enormous transactional power in tariffs, and it's really interesting how different tariffs are. Basically, American history is tariffs, 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 no tariffs in terms of how we get our revenues. So it was largely tariffs for a long time, not to fund anything like the state that we have today, but that was it. And then really after the war, even a little before, you really have almost nothing producing revenue other than taxes. And tax politics is very different from tariff politics. And it's really, I was just reading for a review of a book about taxation and how it relates to citizenship and so forth. Really wonderful book. But the pieces you can maneuver on taxes are not, they're not micro. They're not like the president or Congress can say, "Hey Fritz, you're getting a 15% tax rate this year. How do you like that?" Or say, "Hey, dude, you're going to 70%." You
Yeah.
can't do that with
But
taxes.
tariffs.
There are definitely things you can do with carried interest rates and different depreciation allowances, and there are things you do in taxes that are broadly transactional, but they're covering a pretty broad range. Tariffs are super transactional. And if you look at the older history, you read some of the older political science, like as soon as we got into tariffs, I was like, years ago, for weird reasons, I had to read, I'm sure you know the book Politics, Pressures, and the Tariff by E. Schatzschneider. It's like
It's
great, legendary, old time political
required
scientist.
reading.
It's like a
Absolutely.
fascinating book, but it's like, this is not relevant. This is not the politics of our time. So it was like, it's interesting, it's historically interesting, but there was so much power in tariffs to be super transactional, and you could, the senator from Kentucky could cut a deal with the senator from Maine, and everybody's in a very micro way. And I think what we're seeing now is Trump realizing, I can take all that power instead of that being transactional within Congress. That's all my power. That's my transactional power, and I can do it. I can do it with particular industry. I can do it with people. I can do it with individual companies. I can do it with countries. The uncertainty is actually part of the game. And the uncertainty, of course, is like, I don't understand how you could rebuild manufacturing unless there's some level of guarantee that this will be the policy for 5 or 10 years, just because building factories takes time and investment. But for the kind of presidency we have right now, that transactional power is the whole game. And I think that is a better explanation than any broader economic logic.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. We'll come back to some of these issues. I know, Naz, perhaps you want to draw us out a little bit more on the economic side of things, and then I think we want to come back to the legal and political issues, many of which you just foregrounded. So
Thank
you.
you. I wish we had allocated 10 hours for this session, and instead of just an hour and a quarter, we could go on. But I did want to dig a little bit deeper on some of the economic consequences that have already been mentioned on both the domestic and international side. And Wendy, perhaps I could start with you on the domestic side. You made the point a few minutes ago about and kind of picking up on what Mark was just saying, that the differential effects of the policies that are being applied are already very evident. And so would love for you to help us understand a little bit more in terms of different sectors across the United States. So where do you see who's winning and who's losing, right? To put it in a sort of political economy language. And in particular, I would really love to understand a little bit more the sort of differences between the impacts on producers and consumers writ large. So I'm asking sort of two different sets of questions. I recognize that, but would love any reflections on that.
Oh my goodness, there's a lot there. So, in winners and losers. So, if you're an aluminum producer or a steel producer in the United States, you're very likely winning, because you don't have a lot of inputs into your product that are tariffed, unlike if you are um, a, a domestic producer of, I'm trying to think of something that is just very obviously produced domestically. That's also not complicated. Like I keep thinking motor vehicles, but in fact, there's a bunch of carve outs in the world of motor vehicles.
Right.
Um, if you're a domestic producer, you likely have inputs into your production that are tariffed. One of the reasons why I'm also having a hard time with this is that there are a bunch of other factors that are buffeting these industries around, like immigration. It may well be that you're being benefited in this one way, but hurt in this other way. And then on the flip side, the deregulatory environment that Trump has put in place has really benefited industries. And this transactional approach that he's brought also is really benefiting industries that can get to him or benefited particular firms that can get to him. So even firms that are facing tariffs that are where it's raising their costs, they may say they are on net better off in this current environment than under Biden because they can get to Trump and then get carve outs for various things and get whatever project they're trying to get green lighted, they can get it green lighted because they have access to the administration. And so, there's certainly industries that are being helped or hurt in narrower regards, but I think these industries and these firms are looking at it more broadly and thinking, oh, I can do business with this administration. I just need to know who to call and who to butter up. One thing I'll say about consumers, I think broadly, when people look at the current economic environment, a lot of people in my world express a lot of surprise that the economy is as strong as it is. Because their intuition was that the kind of tariff activity that we've seen and the threatened tariffs, that were put in place sometimes over the course of a day and then withdrawn, just their intuition was that that should be enough to break our economy. And for a minute and a half, it looked like it might be. It looked like firms were worried enough about the uncertainty caused by the lurching tariff policy that they were starting to really significantly pull back on their investment plans. But things have settled down enough that we're now more in the ballpark of this is a hit to firms' bottom line. This is going to lower their profits, on this one margin from higher tariffs. But all in with everything else going on, they can work in this environment and they're okay. And it's not enough to break the economy. And then we always thought, like, if you had this level of tariffs, this kind of effective tariff rate, it should be enough to, let's say, boost the price level by maybe 2%, maybe more like 1.7 percentage points. And that wasn't ever going to happen all at once. So that's maybe 3/4 of a percentage point, 0.7 percentage points this year, maybe another 0.5 percentage point next year, maybe a little bit more in 2027. And put that in the context of the kind of inflation that was driving all of us in the public mad during 2022, 2023 of like 9% inflation. They're just different animals. And so I think people came into this with the wrong intuition that this kind of tariff activity was going to create 2022 style inflation, which it never was, and break the economy, which, it could have done if Trump hadn't like settled down a little bit. So I think we still have a lot more tariff inflation in train,
Yeah.
but it's all going to be in the, 0.2 percentage points here, 0.1 percentage point there, 0.5 percentage point here. It's going to be the stuff that, in the aggregate is going to be annoying, but not going to be enough to break the economy.
No. Thank you so much for that really nuanced picture. And it seems to me that you've really emphasized the effects of this uncertainty, right? And each of you has used that word. I've been making notes. I could do a little tally of how many times we've said that. I'm a political scientist, and so it seems from a macroeconomic sense, uncertainty is negative, but in a political sense, if you have access to the people who are dishing out the goods, then uncertainty is not necessarily a bad thing, right? And I think each of you has sort of said that in different ways that is really interesting. And Nina, I wanted to kind of shift the sort of same insight and question about the uncertainty to international trade, and ask you to help us understand how, if at all, the Trump administration's tariff policies have started to shift global trade patterns. And given the sort of 25-year arc that you described in your opening remarks, and as you said, the move away from the rules-based order, the move toward this more arbitrary sort of discretionary approach, how is this uncertainty changing global trade patterns, and where does this sort of lead us?
Mhm. Yeah, I think just like what Wendy just mentioned in terms of what the current state and what may still yet occur, I think the proof will still be in the pudding, which is still in process and still in train. And I think it's interesting because over the last several years, there's just been, for example, a significant focus, say, on the risks that China poses to the world trading system. And so US policy had been, well, let's encourage companies to, if they aren't going to produce in the United States, produce, this concept of friendshoring, produce in allied countries, or really not China, right? But the tariff issues changed that as well, because whether a company was producing in China or producing in Vietnam or in another market, it was still getting it with tariffs, and companies still are. So I think the trading patterns question is really one that is somewhat TBD in terms of how this will ultimately play out. Now, I think that the changes to the world trading system are really quite tectonic. The World Trade Organization had sort of reached its height in 1994 with its creation, and has really been in decline since then, much to the chagrin of those of us who follow and have been students of the world trading system and the rules-based trading system. And there were three just kind of jewels, crown jewels of the WTO, right? There were the negotiations, there was the dispute settlement process, and then there was the tariff rates. And one by one, these dominoes have fallen, right? The first was the trade negotiations. There has not been a multilateral round of negotiations since 1994, and have been only limited activities since then. The Doha development round died in 2017, if not well before that. The appellate body, which is the appeals process through the WTO, has also been in slow decline, really since 2018. The US and others have just simply been unwilling to confirm judges to the appeals process. So even if a country wants to appeal an unfair trade practice to the WTO, there's nowhere to go with it. There's no appeals process. So that's strike number two. And then the third, the most favored nation, or the concept that all WTO members would essentially extend the same tariff rates to everyone, suffered a huge blow just yesterday with the Trump administration putting forward its WTO reform proposal, indicating first off that the WTO is just not up to the task anymore of being an institution where difficult trade issues could be dealt with. And number two, questioned whether even MFN was a principle that could be sustained in the world trading system. I would argue that 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 was really put aside on January 20th with the use of these types of unilateral tariffs that we've seen. But your question was about trade flows, right? So we have the economic pieces, we have the rules changing too. So I think that it's gonna continue to be I think an open question about where we ultimately go with this, where we have both the economic and the legal pieces of this changing in the fashion that they are.
Yeah. No, thank you so much for that. Really illuminating your characterization of the global trade regime. In a sense, people kind of blame President Trump for its demise, but it sounds like it was already on its way to going downhill, as you said, from 1994. And perhaps the Trump administration's policies are recognizing a reality and kind of accentuating it, but responding to what was. That's an interesting provocation. Fritz, I know you want to ask some more
No.
questions about the politics, so I'll turn
Well,
it back to you.
Nina just described the sort of all the pressures of slow motion and now rapid destruction of international trade institutions, which frankly part of a broader set of attacks on international institutions and the whole apparatus of a global order, as it were. Mark, let me come back to you and bring it back home a little bit to the domestic institutions. It would seem that the U.S. Constitution granted Congress exclusive purview over tariffs. But in fact, there's a Supreme Court case now in front, which and I guess we'll hear, at any point. I don't know when that's going to come out, testing the proposition of whether the emergency, in particular, the Emergency Powers Act, enable or legitimize or the actions that Trump has taken. A couple of questions. One is just help us understand the arguments in that case, and then I'm really curious, coming back to one of your first comments. So maybe we separate these questions. But why, if Trump acted before Congress, why has Congress been so quiet? If historically this was the playground of Congress, and indeed constitutionally was intended to be the focus of Congress. But help us understand first, maybe where we are in terms of this balance of power between the executive and the legislative branch.
Well, it's as transformed a moment as the overall tariff thing is. It is just crazy for anybody who spent time on the Hill, spent time observing Congress. I mean, we're used to the idea they're a prickly bunch. They like their prerogatives. There's, stories of failed presidencies. Jimmy Carter became president and he tried to cut a bunch of water projects that annoyed various powerful men. And that was it. I mean, he was really limited after that because that was a real misstep. And there's a ton of stories like that where, and even the Biden administration, even when they had a Democratic Congress, lots of things they wanted to do. And, these characters like Manchin and Sinema and so forth just got in the way and didn't feel like they had any obligation not to. It's a wildly different situation now, and it's a little hard to explain, especially when you think about tariffs, which are something that will often tend to affect particular districts in a particular way. So you do see some stories about agricultural districts or things like that that are really in feeling the effects much more strongly than the more mild effects that Wendy was talking about, and yet that reluctance, nobody wants to get out there because of Trump, and that's a combination. Obviously, that's a combination of his popularity within the Republican Party, his willingness to use it, and just nobody really wants to go first, and the fact that the Speaker of the House is not, doesn't seem to be interested in protecting their particular interests. So it's extremely unusual in every respect to have a Congress sort of drop away like this. And you see it on plenty of other things too. I mean, they've agreed to a spending bill, and the director of OMB, Russell Vought, has said very clearly, we will use our power to rescind some of this. This is a classic fight over executive power that took place, excuse me, in the Nixon administration over the Nixon impounding federal funds, refusing to spend appropriated funds, and it got resolved. That was the core of the Budget Act of 1974, is called the Budget and Impoundment Control Act, to sort of make clear that that is not something the president can do. Vote intends to do it anyway, and they're voting for these bills even knowing that the spending they're voting for can be pulled back. It's just a wild period of and probably unsustainable. I mean, at some level they will, and that may be beginning to perceive some electoral weakness, beginning to see that they need to, some of them are just quitting Congress rather than facing the electorate in 2026. But as they see those politics change, maybe they'll reassert themselves. There's only so many primary challenges that the president can sort of organize and run, but it's a question that goes way beyond just this particular tariff situation. Although this particular tariff situation is, as I said, like a unique thing where the president can claim an enormous amount of leverage, and and he can do it in a sense district by district if he chooses to.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. I mean, no doubt you're following the Supreme Court case. I mean, we could ask all of our panelists to hazard a guess of where that comes down. But is it an emergency? Are tariffs, part of regulating? Is this part of foreign policy, and therefore not a tax matter at all? It's really are some of the arguments put forward, or the dimensions along which the case, I guess, will be decided. What do you make of it, Mark? What do you think? Let me put it this way: what do you think is at stake in the Supreme Court, in the outcome of the Supreme Court case?
I think Wendy and Nina know this area better than I do. I think what's at stake is really just whether the Supreme Court will ever step up on this Supreme Court will ever put restrictions, and there you put this case in combination with the hypothetical case that might emerge over the Federal Reserve, where there's one theory of the court is certainly going to allow the president to fire members of independent agencies, even where Congress has authorized them to be independent agencies, like the National Labor Relations Board. That's the case they heard last week. You put those together, I think there's a general theory that the court might do all that, but say, hey, the Federal Reserve is different. And they might say, hey, tariffs are different. Or in this case, the IEEA has certain requirements that the executive branch didn't really follow. In terms of tariffs, I think that's not that significant, because there are three or four maybe other ways that the president can implement tariffs, which are clearly authorized by Congress and given to the power of the presidency. In a way, it's like they want to test the most extreme way of doing it, but they've got other ways of doing it, I think. But again, I will certainly defer to my co-panelists.
Well, I'm curious if Nina or Wendy, you have thoughts on this particular question. And in about 10 minutes, we're going to turn to audience questions. So just to flag that and be ready with your questions. But Nina.
Yeah, maybe a quick point. Maybe a quick point on Mark's really great intervention. I think, I think this litigation on IEEPA is just fundamental, right? Because under the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, Congress has the enumerated authority to conduct commerce with foreign nations. Congress has the enumerated authority under Article 1 to impose taxes. And the IEEPA statute had a predecessor statute, the Trading with the Enemy Act, where President Nixon had actually invoked the very same language, this regulate importation language. I should say, subsequent to when he actually imposed duties. He imposed 10% across the board duties for balance of payment purposes, and subsequently justified it under this statute. And it was upheld by the Federal Circuit, or the predecessor court to the Federal Circuit, which it did not go up to the Supreme Court. And subsequent to that, Congress passed the Trade Act of 1974, which actually explicitly gave the president the authority under Section 122 of that act to impose tariffs for balance of payment purposes, which is what President Nixon had used the tariffs for, I believe it was in 1973. Then IEEPA gets passed in 1977, which is, again, the successor statute to Trading with the Enemy Act. Congress keeps that same language in, even though, it had this intervening statute. And so there are all these questions, right, about, well, what was Congress thinking about? The difficulty with IEEPA is that how Congress has the ability to deal with what it delegated to the president. So under the statute, the president has the authority to invoke a national emergency, which looks like an Article 2 power in the Constitution, right? The president's authority to determine what would be like a national security issue sufficient enough to invoke a national emergency. And then Congress gives this laundry list of verbs of the types of things that the president can do in that regard. And that's what the controversy is about. Can the president, once that national emergency declaration's been invoked, can the president use IEEPA to impose tariffs? And the term is regulate importation. And our tariffs included in that concept of regulate importation. Yeah. So I think it's, that is going to be at the heart of it. And in addition to, whether, as opposed to the courts looking behind those national security determinations, for example, which may be more squarely in executive power. So I agree with everything that Mark said. I mean, I think it's going to be really interesting to see whether the court looks to limit that authority, even though there aren't really any guardrails within the statute to regulate that or to pare that back. Or if the court may completely limit the president's authority, which could have implications for, say, how the president executes on sanctions, because it's the same authority used to be able to use IEEPA to impose sanctions.
Yeah, well, a lot at stake there.
Rich, can I just make one? I just want to make one point, drawing these two threads together, which is that whatever the Supreme Court decides, it is not the end of the story. And the issue here is how much authority Congress has given over to the president. And we know then that can happen in reverse too. Congress can get up the gumption to take back this authority and, pass legislation, even, in a veto-proof way, to take back this authority. And if it doesn't do that, and I presume it won't, our next president will not unlearn the lessons that all politicians are now being taught. The next president will know that surely it will be a he, will be able to use this tool for industrial policy, foreign policy, raise revenue without Congress having to pass a difficult vote, and help his friends and hurt his enemies. What future president is going to say, no, I'm not going to use that tool?
Well, that's looking ahead, that's probably right. I can say one thing. I doubt that that's what Congress had in mind when it passed that act. But anyway, we'll Naz, I know you wanted to maybe a question kind of looking at a kind of summary question looking ahead for our panel, and then we do want to get to the questions of the audience.
Yeah, and I'll just remind the audience, like you did a few minutes ago, that we are open for questions. Please submit them via the chat if you'd like to. We do have a few that were submitted earlier that we'll turn to in just a few minutes. But Wendy, you kind of teed up perfectly the next question that I wanted to ask you, which was to kind of help kind of characterize what I see as a kind of a real realignment of the conventional wisdom on political economic thinking on the left and the right and the United States. Nina again kind of reminded us that Trump has been arguing since the 1980s against President Reagan on tariffs, and so here you have this shift from, of course, the Republican Party to having been the party that promoted free markets and free trade and so on to now under President Trump being the incarnation of a very protectionist policy. As you were just pointing out, you had under President Biden the continuation of some of the tariff policies that had been put in place in the first Trump administration. Mark mentioned this too. And so help us understand a little bit kind of how this realignment is taking place and what you sort of see kind of coming to pass in the medium term on that front.
Oh, what I really want to do is listen to Mark's answer to that question.
Okay, that sounds good, Mark. It was redirected to you.
Well, yeah, I mean, there is an interesting realignment on the general left about thinking about tariffs, and there's a set of some of the same people who were thinking about antitrust were also thinking about tariffs and industrial policy, which is something that, in the 90s and later, in the world that Fritz and I worked in, was really unthinkable. I mean, really, the idea was and it was a very broad bipartisan consensus, cross-partisan consensus, that has really that has really fallen away. So there is an enthusiasm on the left to be willing to think about tariff. That it stems from feeling like NAFTA and WTO were kind of the beginning of the raw deal for the American worker, and whether that the degree to which that's true or not is a huge separate debate. But just being willing to use those tools and then to think about, so especially in relation to climate, to build to sort of nurture battery industry and things like that. There's a real value there. But it feels very, just being able to say, yes, we're willing to talk about tariffs on the center left is very different from the set of policies we're seeing right now. But I do want to, I'm interested, I want to say, add one thing to Wendy's point about, basically saying any president is going to do this. I think there's something about, like, for somebody like Joe Biden, for an Obama, certainly, there's something about legitimacy. There's something about that feeling like you've worked with Congress, maybe you only got 2 Republican votes, but you got something, you built something together, kind of like the CHIPS Act under the Biden administration, that you feel like because you've gone through this process, your outcome has some legitimacy. It might last, it might be broadly accepted, it won't be destroyed at the next election. People can have some faith in it. That was an important value for both presidents and members of Congress, and that's kind of not what we're dealing with right now. I mean, there's Julia Azari, who's a political scientist at Marquette, has written about like the difference between a politics based on raw power and one based on legitimacy. And if we get to when we get to the point of rebuilding institutions that have basically been shattered, and that includes the global trading systems, but it also includes the NLRB, other things that I mentioned before. Legitimacy will be an important part of that, and I feel like that's a task of what we have to get to, so that we don't live in a world where every president says, I have, if you remember Rod Blagojevich, the governor of Illinois, when he tried to sell the Senate seat after Obama was elected, where he said, I have this power and it's got to be worth something. I can't remember the exact quote, but basically, we can't really live in a world like that. So this is part of a broader project of how do you restore the importance of legitimacy in political action.
What very, very well said. I'm going to ask the first audience question to Nina, and then Fritz, I'll let you kind of tee up the next one after that. But we have a great question here that sort of reflected one other thing that Fritz and I wanted to talk about, and the person who inputted the question put it better than we did. So I'm going to read it verbatim to you, Nina. If tariffs are causing our trade partners to go elsewhere for the products they used to get from the U.S., Will that relationship ever be restored after a change in the US leadership? Is there anything that can be done to protect these relationships?
Yeah, that it's a great question. I think and it kind of goes, Naz, to your earlier question about, what the effects are on the global supply chain. I think that, we haven't even talked about these trade deals that the president has been cutting, right? I think I think that, the issue with the strategy of the president cutting deals, which are not blessed by Congress, that have not gone through the traditional process, the constitutional process of a trade deal becoming U.S. law through legislation, negotiated by the president and then implemented in law by Congress. I think continues to raise questions about what the actual state of play is with trade relations. So it, where an executive deal can be changed just by virtue of a disagreement by the president with the country's leader, or just a change in heart in terms of what the status is of that nation. It makes it very difficult for companies and even trading partners to just sort of figure out how to continue to navigate this where the relationships don't have that semblance of permanence. So I think that's why when we talk about the demise of the world trading system or the rules-based trading system, it is so serious, because that is what was contemplated after the Second World War, to actually not go back to the 1930s when this happened before. And the hope was always that we didn't have to relive it, that we would learn from history and not relive it. And so when we're thinking about, what do trading relationships look like with allies, with others, I'm getting questions these days from across, business, on, how do we ring fence the United States? Before it was like, how do we ring fence China from risk? And when you think sanctions, you think exports, you think other things. You say, well, how do we ring fence the United States? So I think it's underlying that question is an important question of how the U.S. can remain competitive in this system and remain a dependable trading partner, so that there are investments that will stand the test of time, as opposed to one-off deals that may be cut with the administration.
Thank you. Fritz, I'll let you ask the next one.
Yeah, so full disclosure, this comes from Doug Scrivener, who is certainly a friend and affiliate of the school and maybe of the Scrivener Institute. So Doug asks if it is not clear if this is simply Trumpian hyperbole, but the president has suggested that we could eliminate income taxes and rely on tariffs to fund the government. Is this remotely possible or desirable? Maybe Wendy, you could take that one.
Because I couldn't, keep my poker face. No, it is not possible. It is not possible. Our imports are not nearly large enough relative to our whole economy. And we would, if we created tariff rates that were high enough to try to do that, it would create so many distortions that imports would, go to zero. If you think about what our tax system looked like in the 19th century, it made a lot of sense that we relied on tariffs of imported goods, because that was one of the most transparent places that economic activity took place. You could literally see the boat coming into the harbor, and you could literally look at what was coming off the boat. And it was much harder to figure out what a farmer's income was over the course of a year. You had to get information from that farmer, and you had to rely on the accuracy of that information. And then you had to collect the money from the farmer. All of those things were complicated. This is why tariffs are not just, a part of our history in terms of collecting taxes, but when you look at countries today that have a lot of corruption in their economies, they still have to rely on tariffs because that's one of the only places where you can transparently see the economic activity in order to raise money. We have a more advanced economy than that. And so it's not that I mean, we don't have to rely on this really narrow tax base to try to fund our government. We can fund our government using far more efficient means. I appreciate why the president likes to use tariffs as a way of raising revenue because it's a lot less salient of who's actually bearing the incidence of that tax. You can say rhetorically, it's the importer, which is still it's a domestic firm. That's a U.S. company is the importer, but at least it's not me at the grocery store. You can say that the importer, no, got a deal and forced the exporter, the foreign exporter to that importer to cut his prices. So it was really the foreign country that paid the tax. You can make that argument. It's just less salient. When I'm writing a check to the government to pay my income taxes, I know exactly who's paying that bill. It's me. Now, duh, that doesn't mean the incidence is exactly on me. That's sort of baked into my wage and blah, blah, blah. I, encourage everybody to either take, microeconomics and think about incidence or go review their microeconomic textbook if what I said didn't make any sense. But there's a reason that politically tariffs are an appealing tax, but that doesn't make them efficient.
Thank you, Wendy.
Can I add one thing to this?
Yes,
One thing that
absolutely, Mark.
there's two kind of contradictory promises that Trump's, he said maybe we'll just replace all the income tax. He's also said we're going to take all the tariff revenue and we're going to give, I think it's 12 billion, some amount to farmers, which again is you can't do both, or you can do a little bit of both, but you're playing it both ways, and of course that would also it's not that spending would also require legislation, which would bring Congress back in.
Yeah. Nice.
I'll pose the next question sort of to both Nina and Mark. And this comes from our colleague, George DiMartino, who is the instructor of the Global Trade seminar that I mentioned is happening next quarter. And George asks this question. The shift among trade economists against free trade began to unfold by the early 2000s in the wake of economic studies showing the depth of the harm suffered by industrial communities due to competition with China. I think he's referring to the United States, but there are kind of more global effects. So to what degree did that shift facilitate the subsequent political shift? Here's the real question. Does what trade economists say matter at all in the world of politics? Great question from George. Nina, would you like to take a stab at that? And would love to hear from Mark as well.
I feel like Mark needs to take that first.
It's a hot potato.
I think trade economists are a sort of ladder indicator, a lagging indicator of that shift. I mean, I think they're really. I think we neglect the importance of the WTO disruptions in Seattle in 2000 or 99, 2000. There was a real movement there about trade and I feel like a lot of quiet political pressure that kind of got papered over because we still were living in the world of Washington consensus and all that, but was kind of bubbling up. And then I think it's even among the sort of like think tank type people or whatever, I don't think it was necessary. I don't think it necessarily started with trade economists. I think it did start with some people who were, the kind of people who were thinking about antitrust, the kind of people who were thinking about concentrated power, and then also thinking about the economic effect on communities. So I think it's unlikely that trade economists would be the leading movers on this, just because you're kind of educated in the system as it is. But I think there are a lot of different pressures. But I think Trump took it in a quite different direct. I mean, where Trump goes, you could probably draw the line quite differently. You could draw the line through Perot. You could draw the line through that worry about Japan in the 80s and 90s that, it seems like ancient history now, but that was, it was a way of talking about an enemy. It was a
Mm.
political narrative that had a villain built in. Um, and that's kind of the way they're talking. And so some of the policies may be similar, but it's a very different it's two very different lines of thought, I think.
Nina, would you like to come on this as well?
Yeah, and maybe I'll take from a slightly different
Yeah.
perspective. First off, I guess my short answer to would say that I think that what trade economists say will matter or would matter if they can communicate the message in a sharper and I think more understandable way. I think the narrative on trade has been difficult for a very long period of time. We've just seen sort of a political shift around it, meaning that there's no, as we've talked about, there's no major political party right now in the United States that is pro free trade, right? That's the huge shift. But what's underlying that, right? We've talked about this. There's economic dislocations, but it's not just competition from China. It's technology change. Think about AI. We think about all of the different issues, underlying economic issues that are part of this mix of dislocations. It is just much easier to be able to, from a narrative standpoint, blame somebody else. It's easier to blame China than it is to blame a machine, for taking a job. And I don't mean to understate it. I mean, I think the economic changes have been very significant, and they've driven a lot of the political changes that we have seen over the last 15 years to where we are now. But I do think the education on all of this is lagging too, which is allowing for some of these other narratives to be the leading narrative, the salient narrative.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Fritz,
Fritz.
can I
Nina,
just
I,
add
I,
please
I
go
want to
ahead,
come to
Wendy.
you. I want to just quick
Yeah.
comment, and then Wendy, I'm going to give you the last word as our economist here on the panel. Just as Mark will recall, I wrote a book on the narratives of trade, so this is all very familiar territory. But Wendy, I want to come to you, so give you the last word here, as we are just about at time. But quickly defend yourself. No,
No,
as
In
an
fact,
economist.
I was going to go in very much the other direction and say,
Very good.
I think it's not a question of whether just what trade economists say will matter. It's whether what any kind of economist says matters. And frankly, what any kind of person with expertise says, will that matter? And I think my profession has lost a lot of credibility. And I think we are partly to blame for that. I think the way we spoke about trade, we said it only had upside. We only talked about the aggregate benefits of more trade. And then we said, oh, but then the political people will figure out how to get the winners to compensate the losers. And we've done this on a bunch of different fronts, where we have a viewpoint. I'm talking about us as economists. We have a viewpoint, and we are so distrustful of our audience understanding nuance or uncertainty that we express our analysis as if it was, with full and complete certainty, and it only has this one effect that we're talking about. Freer trade is good. And we're loath to then talk about any of the but, caveats, asterisks. But I think we do that not just about trade. I think we do that about climate. I think we do that about immigration. I think we do that about AI and technological change more broadly. And I think we need to learn as a profession, again, just economists, but I think this is broader, of how to trust our audience to, actually not just be spoon-fed our talking points.
Yeah. Great points, and points I think our questioner would tend to agree with. He also, I'll advertise his book, The Tragic Science. Um, we are at time, and I'm so sorry. As Naz said, we wish we could have a lot more time. It's been a fabulous discussion. But let me thank our panelists, all three of you, for such a rich conversation. Let me thank our partners, AEI, the Hoover Institute, the Aspen Institute, and New America. And thank all of you in the audience for being part of the Denver Dialogues. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great privilege.